All right, Love, take it away.
Thank you, Jen. And so again, today we're going to be talking about solar and all the things that go on in an escrow transaction and how you can help make your transaction smoother when there are solar panels on the property. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat box and we'll address all questions at the end. I'm going to go through the slides kind of quickly. That way, if you guys have any questions, we can spend a little bit more time at the end addressing those, because I know there's, I'm going to go over like the gist of what generally happens in a transaction with solar. So here we go.
Poof. Why is it not? There we go. This is all the facts about Love. They'll be on screen at the end again.
All right, so how does solar affect your escrow transaction? Anytime, as an escrow holder, our job is to uphold the contract and to clear title. When you get a copy of your preliminary title report, two of the potential items that you might see on the report are a financing statement or a notice of solar energy producer contract. These are items that will have the seller's name on them, and those are the items that we look for that give us the indication that there is solar on the property. So with these items, because they have the seller's name on them, they're specific to the property owner, we do have to release them and in order to clear title. So we have to reach out to the solar company and go through the transfer process. So unfortunately, no two companies are exactly alike when it comes to the solar transfers. So that part kind of makes it a little bit difficult because there isn't a blanket answer for how to handle the solar transfer for every single company that there is out there. Some companies require for you to submit a request online. Some companies require for us to submit the information. Others will require for the seller to call in to initiate the transfer. So it just depends. Your best bet is to reach out to us or to reach out directly to the solar company in order to obtain that information to see how to get the solar process started. Another thing to take into consideration is that the fees can also vary. Some companies charge about $150, others can charge up to $350 to complete the transfers. Right now, because there is such a high volume of sale and refinance transactions, we're experiencing kind of a longer turn times for solar transfers to be processed. So it's really a good practice to get those solar transfer requests put in right at the beginning of your transaction. That way you don't experience any delays towards the end.
Click.
So what questions should you be asking when you take on a listing? So the main thing that you want to ask your seller is what kind of solar do you have? Is it leased or is it owned? So the difference between the two obviously is if it's leased, the solar panels you're going to pay on them every month, but they are property that belongs to the solar company. You're just leasing them. Whereas if you own them, the payments that you make or the lump sum payment that you made to pay off the panels, those are your panels. Panels are personal property, so those then belong to you. Another question that you will want to ask is, what type of financing is in place? So are you able, does your seller have access to those agreements? It's a really good practice to kind of have those agreements on hand. That way, if you're doing an open house, or if the buyer's agent comes in and they're asking questions about the solar, you have all of that paperwork on hand, and it'll detail exactly what the payment amounts are and what the current agreements are that the seller has in place with the solar company. So again, it'll be a lease agreement or a power purchase agreement. Really good to have those on hand and available. What happens if the buyer doesn't qualify or they don't want the panels? Is your seller willing to pay off the panels, have them removed, or if they can't be transferred into the new buyer's name, you want to ask those questions about what will your seller do. So just good to have a game plan as to if they can't qualify, what are we going to do? What's going to be the next step? Just be ahead of the game there. And the other type of financing that can be used is through the HERO or PACE assessments. And this is where we'll talk about this a little bit more, but this is a way where the customers can obtain solar panels and other things as well, and other energy efficient things that they can add onto their homes, like windows or grass, roof, solar. Solar is one of the big ones that we see a lot through the HERO or PACE assessments. So you'll want to ask if they obtain their financing through those means. All right, so factors to consider when you have leased solar on the property. So again, solar is personal property. So it's affixed to the home, but it's not truly a part of the home. So again, personal property, it is in the event of a foreclosure, the lender can't take the panels. It's not a part of the home in that sense. They're affixed to the house. There's a UCC filing that gets recorded against the property. It's a fixture filing. So just, something to remember, if it's leased, it belongs, at the end of the day, the panels still belong to the company. And if you don't obviously pay the lease, then they can come in and take the panels back. So you'll need to know what the payment amount is for the panels. This is really important to know, especially if your buyer is going to be obtaining a loan through the transaction, because your lenders will need to know that lease amount in order to factor it in to the whole situation when they're obtaining the loan. So it does affect the customer's debt to income, I believe, and then they do have to take it into consideration that it's another item that has to be paid for every month. So it does affect the buyer's being able to qualify for the loan. So super important, again, to get those lease agreements or power purchase agreements over to your lenders as soon as you can in the transaction, just so that they can get all of that paperwork dialed in and there's no delays. So typically in the solar transfer process, the buyers do have to go through a credit check. It's a soft credit check is what I have been told by solar companies. So there's some instances in which they will also allow for the lenders to submit a copy of their credit report. That way the customers don't have to have their credit run again. And then, in a little bit, we'll talk about what happens if your buyer doesn't qualify through the credit check. So the steps in transferring over leased solar. So it all starts with reaching out to the solar company in order to find out what their process is. Now, as an escrow holder, there are most times where we do help facilitate the process of getting the solar paperwork signed, but there are a lot of instances in which the solar companies will want to send out that paperwork on their own. So they will reach out to us and ask us for the customer's contact information, phone numbers, email addresses, and then they go ahead and send out that paperwork. But we always have to start with someone does have to initiate the transfer process. Most of the time, they do want an authorization from the seller in order to release any information to us. So it's always a good practice as well when you do take on a listing to go ahead and have your seller call into the solar company just to inform them that the home is being listed and that they authorize any third parties such as an escrow company, lenders, buyers, and brokers to obtain information about their solar panels. So once that initial request has been sent and the solar company has the customer's contact information, then the solar company will send out a credit application for the customer to complete so that they can get their credit checked. After the buyer has qualified, the solar company will then send out the transfer paperwork, or they'll provide us with escrow instructions and the transfer agreements, and then we will send them out to be signed. And within the escrow instructions, sometimes there's solar bills that have to be paid. We can collect for those through escrow with the customer's permission, and then we go ahead and get everything signed. After all of the transfer papers are signed, the customers will then basically be approved and we're good to go on the solar there. So at that time is when the solar company will prepare the releases that we need in order to clear title. So those two items that you might see on your preliminary title report, a financing statement and the solar energy producer contract. So those are two items super important for us to obtain releases on in order to clear title and close escrow. And after those are prepared, the solar company then go ahead and after we close escrow and inform them that we've closed escrow, they'll countersign the agreement and then complete the transfer on their end. All right, so factors to consider when the solar panels are owned. So if your seller owns the panels, they should have some sort of documentation to show that they've paid for the panels in full. When the panels are paid for in full, just like if your home was paid for in full, there won't necessarily be any items on the preliminary title report that indicate to us that there's solar on the property. So because the two items that we see if they're solar, again, are the financing statement and the solar contract. So if there's a lease agreement or some sort of payment agreement between the solar company and the property owner, then those items get recorded. But if it's owned free and clear, then we don't typically see anything recorded on the prelim for this. If there is a loan, though, for the solar panels, then we will see a UCC agreement, which is a fixture filing. It's specific to the panels, and that item does require to be paid in full through escrow, or we can have the buyer assume the loan. I personally have had one transaction in which we were able to successfully have a buyer assume a solar loan. And I actually have one right now where we're going through the process. And I'm waiting to see if this buyer is able to actually complete the assumption. The buyer is essentially getting another loan. The lender is very hands-on and they're involved in the whole process as well. And there's a lot of paperwork that our buyer's new lender is having to review and look over as well. Most of the time, though, when it's owned solar, the parties agree for one party to pay it off in full through escrow. So most of the time it's the seller, but obviously everything's negotiable. If the buyer wants to pay for the panels in full through escrow, that is something that we can do as well. Alrighty, and so again, if you're a buyer purchasing a home that has owned solar, you're very lucky. All of the power purchase agreement, any agreements though, if there are any with a solar company that provided the panels, so things like maintaining them, cleaning them, things like that, when it's owned, that typically gets handled outside of escrow. Alrighty, so going back to PACE and HERO assessments, there's also another assessment, it's a Y-Green assessment. These are government programs that allow for the customers to obtain energy efficient products, and they are able to pay for these products through their property taxes. So property taxes are due twice a year, and within the property tax bill, it will have an assessment. So if you ever have a transaction in which the property taxes seem a little bit higher than usual, then it probably has one of these assessments added into the tax bill. So with these assessments, they do have to be paid in full through escrow. The customers can obtain, there's different types of things that these assessments can be used for. So like I had mentioned earlier, I've seen customers do it for artificial lawn, windows, roof, but one of the biggest things that we see is solar. So again, these have to be paid in full through escrow, and there's no way to transfer these items. And this applies even if you're doing a refinance. So for all my lenders out there that are listening, anytime you have a HERO, PACE, or Y-Green assessment, this is something that you have to take into consideration. For most lenders, it's considered a cash out if we're paying off any sort of second loans. So just be aware of that and look at your tax bills when you're taking on a refinance, just so that you can be aware of it right up front if there is one of these assessments that has to get paid in full. So with wide grain assessments, there is a little extra step that we have to do as an escrow holder. So with these assessments, when we get the payoff demands, the wide grain assessment people, they don't give us a full payoff. They say in the verbiage of the payoff demand that we have to pay the full year's property tax bill. So if your customer is closing escrow from July 1st to January 1st, your buyers are going to pay a little bit more upfront because the full tax bill has to be paid for. So there has to be a little debit and credit between the buyer and seller because the seller has to pay for the full tax bill for the entire year. And then your buyer would have to give the seller a credit because they aren't technically, the seller's not responsible for the tax bill during the period from January to July. So just to keep in mind that if you are closing between from July to January, and there's a wide grain assessment within the taxes, that does cost your buyer a little bit more upfront, but it's for the property taxes that are going to be due the following year anyway. So just a little thing to keep in mind. So what are some of the challenges that may occur in a transaction when you have solar? So one of the biggest things that I see is a buyer not being able to qualify for the solar panels and through the credit check. So this actually is a very easy fix because the solar companies will take on a deposit, and it can range anywhere between $100 to $200. I haven't really seen it go much further than that, but they do allow for the customers to basically pay a fee in order to be able to allow for the solar panels to be transferred into their names. Another challenge that you might experience, and this is something that I have been dealing with a lot lately, is the solar companies just being extremely behind. So what happens if the transfer papers don't go out in time? Unfortunately, we do have to make sure that the customers are approved for the solar transfer before we can close escrow. So that's why it's extremely important for all of our customers to reach out to the solar companies right at the beginning of the transaction, just so that we can get that process started. Very good practice for the listing agents out there. Have your sellers call into the solar company ahead of time, just so that they can put them on notice. And then the solar transfer people, they will actually reach out to the customers as well, just to get a status and see where they're at. Homes are going so fast on the market these days though, so if your seller does call in, chances are by the time they follow up, you're probably going to have a buyer. So it's just a really good practice to do those steps ahead of time if there are solar panels on the property. So paying the transfer fee, this is actually something that has come up recently in my experience, that the sellers say, well, why do I have to pay the transfer fee? So obviously all the fees are negotiable. So it's actually a really good practice right now if for buyer's agents, when you submit an offer, and listing agents, to take into consideration who is going to be paying for the solar transfer fee. So again, that fee can range from $150 to $350, depending on the solar company. So typically I do see sellers pay for the solar transfer fee for the buyers, but we have had a couple instances in which a buyer will pay that $350 fee. So just take into consideration and have that conversation with your customers to address the solar transfer fee. That way it's not a surprise when we give them a call and say, hey, there's this fee that has to be paid in order to transfer the panels. So solar easements. An easement is a document that gets recorded against the property that allows for, usually it's to allow access to the property, to be able to get to a certain location on the property, to be able to perform work on it. For example, you'll see a lot of easements for public utilities. up in the foothills, you'll see easements for people to allow access to get to their property through another property. So solar easements allows for the solar company to come onto the property to maintain the solar panels. But there's also easements and restrictions that you might want to look for on your preliminary title report in regards to what your neighbor can do, what you can do when there are solar panels on the home. So I personally have not seen any restrictions like this, but I have seen a lot more people putting solar on their homes, and a lot more of my title reports that come in do have those financing statements and solar contracts recorded. So I would not be surprised if we started seeing restrictions that come up within the neighborhoods, so CCNRs or within HOA companies, where they might restrict things like how tall your trees can grow, or if you were going to turn your one-story house into a two-story house. You would have to read those restrictions very carefully to make sure that you're not doing anything on your property that could potentially block someone else's solar panels. So just something to look for on your title report when you're reading through it. Click on those hyperlinks so that you can open the documents, and it'll tell you what all those documents are about if you do see any solar easements or CCNRs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. So do you guys have any questions out there? You're welcome to put them in the chat box so that we can address them with you guys.
I can't see the chat, so if someone who can, Robin, Linda, might want to call out some of the questions that are in the chat for Love.
Let's see. Barbara, did you get your question answered with the what if no financing? Okay. Biggest issue for clients has been contacting the solar company. Do you have a list of contact info for the various solar companies, even if there's no financing?
Yes, I do have a list, and I'd be more than happy to share that list. So it'll list all of the major solar companies that we work with, along with their contact information, email addresses, and fax numbers. So I can definitely share that list with everybody. We can
Perfect.
send it.
That's for Julie. So Jen, you writing that down so we remember?
Yes.
Okay.
And I'm sure even the people that didn't ask, now that they know that that exists, might be interested in it. So Love will send it to all the sales execs, and then just let us know if that's something you'd like a copy of.
Daniel Fee asked, who pays for the transfer? Is a power purchase considered a lease?
So in most situations, the seller does pay for the solar transfer fee. There have been a couple instances with me where I have had a buyer pay for the transfer fee when the seller did not want to. So, you know, that was obviously negotiated, but typically it is a fee that the seller pays for. And then, is a power purchase agreement considered a lease? So every solar company out there has a different agreement with the customer. It's my understanding that they kind of do go hand in hand, but it's best to reach out to the solar companies in order to obtain all of the agreements and to understand exactly what agreement is in place. Given that there are so many different solar companies out there, and it seems like everybody kind of does things a little bit differently, it's best to ask that question with specifically to the property that you're working with and the solar company that you're working with on that transaction.
And then on payoff, solar company should release the UCC one. What if not done?
So when we, as an escrow holder, when we pay off companies, after the company receives the payoff for, be it a mortgage, a line of credit, a solar, a water softener, anything that they record a lien for and we pay them, it is their obligation to record the release that goes along with that payoff. So with a mortgage company, they'll record a reconveyance. With solar companies, if there's a UCC agreement, they will terminate that agreement. So if they don't terminate it, that's where we come in as a title company. So in the event, let's say your customer purchased a home and in that transaction, the seller paid off the solar panels. And now your customer is selling the home and that solar financing statement is still there. I actually had this happen to us recently where the solar panels were actually removed from the property. We just reached out to the solar company. It was a mistake on their end. They just didn't file the release, and they provided us with the release and had it recorded with the county. So in the event that it doesn't get released, it's not necessarily the end of the world. It's, you know, people they make mistakes and sometimes things get overlooked. So the termination can still be filed as long as we followed their instructions. So if we paid the loan off in full, then they would need to terminate that agreement as long as we followed their instructions through the escrow transaction.
And then generally, how long does a HERO lien release take to get recorded?
So that depends on how backed up the county is. So it all lands in the hands of the Fresno County tax collector and the HERO department. So when we pay off a HERO assessment, that money all goes to HERO, and then they notify the Fresno County tax collector. Now, as most of you know, the county tax collector and most county offices are very behind. So it's usually not until the next installment period that we will see that the taxes get reassessed and that HERO assessment is removed. So in the transactions that we handle, we do have to stop and think about the tax bill and who is going to be paying for the tax bill. And is the tax bill going to be amended in time so that the buyer doesn't incur a new bill? So for our transactions, we need to hold enough money from the seller side to be able to pay the taxes in full. And then eventually, it's almost like the taxes end up getting paid twice because HERO collects it, but then we also have to make sure that the taxes get paid directly to the county. So eventually the customer will receive a refund back from HERO for any overpayments. So typically any portion of the HERO assessment that was going to go to the tax collector, that will end up getting refunded back to the customer. But we have to pay it up front in the event that they don't get their paperwork done in a timely manner, so that the buyer doesn't end up incurring that tax bill, because sometimes they don't reassess the taxes in time, and it can take a couple months and even go into the following tax year before they will go ahead and reassess that bill.
Perfect. Judy Notebloom, to answer your question, yes, it's recording and we will get it to you. And then can you go over a PPA info? Can those be paid off in escrow?
Yes, so we can do a buy down on a power purchase agreement. We've done that a handful of times where a buyer or a seller, if they want to pay for the agreement in full for the customer, we just have to have an invoice from the solar company. That is something that we can help facilitate with obtaining as well. The buyers, there's different agreements, again, with every solar company. That's what makes solar kind of difficult, is because every solar company is different. Every agreement can be different because everything can be negotiated. So specific to your transaction though, always do reach out to the solar company and obtain that information. We're more than happy though to pay down the agreement or pay off the agreement in full through escrow.
On Joseph has a question of, I have a transaction with solar panels financed by PACE. The financing contract says that it is assumable.
So in my experience, I have not seen one yet where a PACE assessment has been assumed by a buyer. One of the main reasons why I haven't seen it, I believe though, is because most lenders want for any hero, PACE, or Y-Green assessments to be paid in full through escrow. Technically speaking, the tax collector is always in first position because they have the power to sell if your property taxes don't get paid. So my understanding and interpretation of it is that most lenders, when they underwrite the loan and they look at a hero, PACE, or Y-Green assessment, that's a loan ahead of their loan, and they don't want that. So that's where you may not be able to assume a PACE or hero or Y-Green assessment. It's not that it's not assumable, it very well could be. I've done it in a cash transaction where our buyer essentially said, I want to show the hero or PACE assessment on my final title policy. So it was assumed that way, but the buyer's name wasn't on it. They just took it on as an encumbrance on their property. So Joseph, though, I'm curious, is there a loan transaction involved, and has your lender approved for the solar to be assumed in the solar PACE assessment to be assumed in the transaction?
Yeah, most lenders say no more, huh? That happened about a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
Hammer wants to know if you can get a PDF of the slides, Jen.
I already answered yes.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Shannon, if buyer can and does assume the solar lease, that can mess up their DTI ratio on their home loan, right?
Yes, that is correct. So that's why it's important as a buyer's agent, when you go and you show a home that has solar, for you to work closely with your lender and with the seller's agent and the seller with obtaining that power purchase agreement or the lease agreement, because it can blow up your transaction. I have seen it happen. We've gotten all the way to the end and somehow everyone missed that there was solar on the lender side, and it ended up making it so that the buyer couldn't qualify for the loan because the payment was too high. I have seen it though where the buyers or the sellers or the agents, they'll contribute and they'll buy down the lease agreement or pay off a certain portion of it so that the overall payment of the lease agreement goes down, but it can affect your transaction, and that's why it's super important to get that information over to the lender as soon as possible so that they can take those numbers into consideration.
And I don't know if there's a good answer for this one, but how much more time is generally needed to delay escrow close?
So I would say with the solar, if most companies, they quote a turn time of anywhere between 10 to 14 days in order to be able to process the request, to get their transfer papers out, to perform the credit check, prepare the releases, and deliver them to escrow. So 10 to 14 days. So if you have a cash transaction and you're looking to close in 5 days, sometimes that can be difficult to accomplish because there's solar in the way. So it's important to take those things into consideration. I know that everybody is moving as fast as they can, especially when you have a cash transaction, but sometimes the solar companies, they can delay things. So usually a lot for anywhere between 10 to 14 days in order to process the transfer. Some companies, they can do it faster. For example, Tesla, when we submit a request to them online, they ask for what our closing date is. And most companies, they do try to prioritize all of their files based on closing date, just like we do. You know, if you have a 5-day cash transaction and it needs to close right away, you know, that one unfortunately is going to come before the 90-day escrow. So, and in most companies, they will prioritize and assist. Calling them is also helpful. If you get your seller on the phone with them and have them explain the situation that you're closing very quickly, that's also helpful. These days though, the other day I spent 3 hours on hold trying to get a hold of a solar company, and then I got hung up on. So it can be a frustrating process, but as long as you try to be proactive and address a lot of the things ahead of time and towards the beginning of the transaction instead of waiting till the end to address the transfers, then it'll help with making your transaction go smoother and avoid any delays.
And I think this question was answered already from Shannon. He asked for a lender to make this determination. So I'm not sure if that's what he's talking about there. So I don't know if that was the third part to his 2-part question. Shannon, are you still on? Maybe not. And then Judy, your question was answered. How much longer to anticipate for a solar is included? And what happens if the buyer does not want the solar?
So if the buyer does not want the solar, that is fine. The seller would need to reach out to the solar company and look to see what their agreement is. Because if they are locked into a lease, that those panels may have to go with the property owner to their new home. They may have to pay a penalty in order to break the lease. When you have panels removed, there can be damage from the roof, and unfortunately solar companies do not cover that damage. So if your buyer is going to, if they don't want the panels and they're going to ask for them to be removed, just take into consideration the things that can happen to the property physically in terms of the roof, or if it's going to cost the seller extra money in order to break the lease or terminate it early and have to pay a fee for that.
And then Carrie asked, is there a way to prorate the true up?
So true ups, I haven't seen one yet in which a solar company had us do that. We, as an escrow holder, can take an instruction though from the parties in the event that there is a bill that needs to be prorated. So anything that the customers want us to prorate, so if there's a true-up bill, if there's a solar bill, anything like that, we can prorate it through escrow. We just need an instruction to do so. So putting it on an addendum is the best way to ask us to do that.
And I think that's the same question Rhonda just had. How often do you see the true-up bill being negotiated and perhaps being seller paid in escrow?
We can pay a true-up bill through escrow. I haven't seen though, I haven't had one come across my desk yet though where we did pay it. Now, if the true-up is being, it depends on who it's being paid to, because I've heard that the true-ups, it can be paid to PG&E, which is something that unfortunately we wouldn't be able to do because we don't pay utility bills. But if it's being paid to the solar company and it's a part of the solar transfer in order to get the transfer completed, then we would have to pay for it. So it depends on, unfortunately, who we're paying. If it ends up going to PG&E, then it's a utility bill and we can't pay for that. It's just not something that we can do. But if it is, in fact, going to the solar company, then we're able to pay it.
And I think that's all of our questions, unless I missed somebody.
Yeah, if anybody would like to unmute and ask a question, we'll open it up to that.
Jacqueline, I see that you asked a question.
Oh, she just did, yeah.
Solar City contract, but the company was purchased by Tesla. Do we contact Tesla? Yes. And there's a lot with Solar City and Vivint, actually, there have been a lot of contracts that have been transferred over to Tesla, and Tesla is going to be where you will start with in terms of getting the solar transferred. Now, if you did call Solar City, I actually don't think Solar City is around anymore, but if you called them, they might refer you to Tesla, and the same thing with Vivint. If you end up calling the wrong solar company, they will tell you, oh, we had this contract at one point, but it's actually been transferred, and they'll provide the other company's contact information to you.
I think we're good.
Any other questions?
Okay.
I do want to thank you all so much for.
Wait, we do have someone.
So Shannon Moore accidentally sent her third part to me instead of to everyone. It reads, if the lender needs to revise their DTI, if they're assuming a solar lease, I'm sure it takes longer.
Yes, that is correct. So it just depends on who the lender is and how quickly they are able to make those adjustments. But again, that's why it's super important anytime you have a lease agreement to get that number for the payment amount and the agreement over to your lenders right away. That way they can process that and work out the numbers in a manner so that it doesn't ruin the transaction.
Okay, and there's another one that says, how often do you see the true-up bill being negotiated and perhaps being seller paid in escrow?
I personally have not, I have yet to pay a true-up bill through escrow. We do pay for like the previous month for the owner when it's with SunPower. That's the only company that I have seen where they require for a month of the bill to be paid for through escrow. But every other company, it's just a transfer fee. Tesla, they require for the transfer fee to be paid for upfront. They send us an email and it has a link through PayPal. You can pay through PayPal or through your credit card, and it's a $150 fee that they charge for the release. And again, it has to be paid for upfront. And then SunPower is the only company that I've seen where we pay a bill. I have not seen any true-up bills though have to get paid.
Thank you.
All right, well, I think that that concludes our class today. We're done a little bit early, and we actually haven't decided on our topic for next month, but we will be choosing that shortly. If you ever have any suggestions on things you'd like to know more about, please let your sales exec or me know. We've got a wealth of information and some amazing escrow officers. I'd like to take just a second if everybody could put their hands together and just clap for Love, or take yourself off mute. Love, thank you so much. And we will have the recording and slides available to anybody that's asked. I am going to try to save the chat to make sure that we don't miss anybody. But if for any reason you're worried, don't hesitate to just email myself or your sales exec. Thanks so much for joining, and have a fantastic day.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.